you very much. So thank you, Veronica. I actually hope to paint a picture about rural youth employment here. And we're going to look at some basic considerations, some EU statistics, real-life project examples as well. And also some policy and information tools will be listed and mentioned. But these latter things will be discussed more in detail during the work of the thematic group overall. So I'm really going to focus on statistics and real-life examples. But first, some basic considerations. We think that all of these pieces of this puzzle, and yeah, it's an arbitrary selection, are very important. So for rural youth employment, in the rural economy, if we look at the bottom left corner, the role of agriculture, non-agri businesses, the third sector and public sector, and how these interact with each other, how these work together can be very different in different member states and can actually define the context for rural youth employment. The third sector may not be the biggest employer, but it can be important in services, networking, education, and other such activities. And we mentioned digitalization because its impact is growing in all sectors. So it affects all types of jobs and all sectors of the economy. If we go to the other corner, population is also important because how this changes in rural areas will define the composition of the labor force. Who's there? Is it more younger, older people who are available to do the jobs that are there in a certain region in the EU? There are some specific trends here. The population, rural areas getting older, more women moving into towns and cities than men, migration to rural areas, both internal from other regions, internal migration and immigration from other countries. These can play a role. For jobs in the labor market, there are types of jobs that are offered and there are types of jobs that can be created. And of course, this is very much linked to educational and skills level of the labor force, then the gender composition, the balance of men and women in the labor force. And there's also availability of employment offices and other factors that can be important. Excuse me. For rural services, which is the last piece in the puzzle, funding, training, advice, and other supplementary services, also infrastructure are very important and key for business activities and for jobs locally. And of course, it helps if you have a business-friendly culture and attitudes. We saw some examples mentioned by the Finnish young entrepreneurs about collaboration, cooperation with others, sharing knowledge with entrepreneurs from the same field. So if some of these are missing, starting and maintaining a rural business becomes a challenge. So in this thematic group, we are talking about rural youth. So as you can see from this slide, there are several ways to define who is young. But for the purposes of this thematic group, rural youth is defined as young people of age 18 to 30 years who are normally resident in rural areas, even if some of their activities are linked to cities. For example, they study there. But of course, we have members who are over 30 and their perspectives are equally important. And as you can see here, the young farmer definition is people aged less than 40. In the following slides, we will take a quick tour of statistics based on information from Eurostat, but our source is primarily the Rural Observatory website. You will get all the links later in the presentation. So first, let's take a quick look at how the EU's population developed, between 2015 and 2020. The general trend of aging is clear from this figure. You can see that older than 65 years is growing everywhere in all types of regions, urban, intermediate, and rural regions. If we look at the other two age groups, though, we see that the negative trend affecting the younger and working age population is stronger in rural areas, while in urban regions, both age groups increased their presence. So let's look at now the structure of the economy. So it's in terms of percentage of people employed by main sectors. So this diagram shows you data from 2018, and you can immediately see the relatively high share of the service sector, which is shown by gray color, and lower shares for agriculture and industry in most member states. When we look for trends, we find that in the EU, the share of the agriculture, forestry, and fisheries in rural regions employment went from 21% in 2000 to 12% in 2018. The share of industry overall was is more or less the same between these two dates, but it increased in Romania, Lithuania, Poland, Latvia, Czechia, and Bulgaria, while it decreased in most other member states. What is most apparent is the share of the service sector, even in rural areas, and on average it increased by 10 percentage points. More significantly than the EU average, rural regions of Romania, Lithuania, Croatia, Latvia, but also Greece, Portugal, Spain, and Ireland. From sectors of the economy, let us now move on towards employment. We mentioned employment, and this is expressed in employment rate, which is the percentage of people, employed people within a specific age range in relation to the total population of the same age. So this data tells us that the employment rate is higher than the EU average in rural areas. You can see it's 73.1%, the EU average, and 73.6% in rural areas. The employment rate for men is higher than for women in general. This is what we call the gender employment gap, but this gap is larger in rural areas than for the whole population. And this gender employment gap was the smallest in rural areas, for example, in Malta, France, Belgium, Estonia, and Finland. And it was highest in Romania. If you look at the numbers for youth, you can immediately see that the lowest employment rates for both in the EU and in rural areas is for youth. So while the EU population increased by almost 5 million between 2013 and 2021, the rural population decreased by about 6 million in the same period. When we look at unemployment rate for the age group 15 to 74, this is much less less in rural areas than overall EU average. You can see there, but youth unemployment is much higher than the unemployment rate for the larger population group. It is also higher for women than for men in rural areas. But when we look at tertiary education, which means after secondary education, people go on to university, college, or short-term courses. This is for the age group 25 to 34. This time, the gender gap is for the advantage of women. So in some member states where this gap is largest, for example, in Slovenia, Slovakia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Sweden, where it's more than 20 percentage points difference in rural women and men for the advantage of women in terms of tertiary education, and lowest in Germany and Romania. So looking at NEET, and NEET is not in education, employment, or training, and this relates to the age group 15 to 29, which is more or less the age group that our thematic group is targeting. As we mentioned, the definition of less than 30 years for purposes of the thematic group. This is slightly higher in the rural areas than the overall EU average, as you can see from the numbers here. And the NEET is higher for women than for men. So there's also a gender gap here, both in the EU overall and for rural areas. But there's when we talk about gender gaps, there's another one to notice and remember, that there's a considerable difference between men and women in part-time employment. Its share is much higher for women than for men. And finally, the percentage of self-employment is higher in the rural areas than in the overall EU. Looking a little bit at the social situation, but it also relates to incomes and whether you have a job or not, because one of the parts of this indicator at risk of poverty or social exclusion is income poverty. So you need to watch the green line here. This indicates rural areas. Even though there has been improvement in all areas of the EU, as you can see, this indicator, this percentage decreased since 2015. This is still the highest in rural areas, higher than in cities and towns and suburbs. And this is also generally higher for rural women than for rural men. Some of the highest shares of this were recorded in rural areas of southern and eastern EU member states. This includes Romania, Poland, Greece, Italy, and Spain. But interestingly, the top 10 of the list also includes France and Germany. So what is the situation with farms? So this data tells us that between 2005 and 2020, there was a slight increase in the number of large farms. But the overall number of farms dropped by 37%, which is huge. And most of this loss in the number of farms hit small farms, smaller than 5 hectares. So in terms of number of people employed by farms, this was about 6% of total employment in 2005. And it became 4.2% by 2020. So there is a drop there as well in terms of number of people employed. The number of farm managers, we have the data here for young farmers aged less than 35, also decreased in this period. But the good news is that there's a slight increase in the share of women farm managers in all age groups below 55 years. And this increase started somewhere around 2016. So it's starting to pick up a little bit, the number of women farm managers. And we saw examples, and we will see examples of young ladies, entrepreneurship and diversification and all these activities. Young farmers were particularly scarce, less than 10% of all farmers in Spain, Greece, Portugal, and Cyprus, for example. So finally, there is the difference in the number of people employed by farms, which is one indicator, and the other is the regular agricultural labor force, which is a higher number because it includes all the people who help with farm work, but are not employed by farms. For example, family members or people for whom working on farms is not their main activity, for maybe seasonal workers. So let's summarize the above, because there we saw so many numbers and so many statistics so far, and there's much more if you want to dig deeper. But as a summary of all of the above, we need to remember 3 or 4 things, really. We need to remember that in the EU, the rural population has a decreasing trend at the moment. There is improvement, that's the second thing, improvement in almost all relevant indicators related to employment or education and the need, not in employment or education or training, since 2012. So there's been improvement overall and in rural areas as well. The only exception to this improving trend are the indicators related to farming. We need to remember, the third thing we need to remember is the gender gap. It relates both to education and employment. Women seem to have more difficulty to find work, move into or re-enter the workforce, or more of them take part-time employment than men. But at the same time, a larger share of women have tertiary education than men, and more of them move to cities or towns than men. So that's to keep in mind. And we also need to keep in mind the differences between member states and even regions within member states and localities when we discuss solutions and opportunities. But you all bring your own background to this, and you are all from different regions, so that will be a very interesting discussion, I hope. Some examples, because local areas in the EU are working on solutions as we speak. And the first example is of a young lady farmer who established a herb garden in Slovenia and managed to expand the business since the first garden was created, and also created 2 full-time jobs. So this is a good example of a woman entrepreneur and farmer. In the second example, recognizing the importance of training, we also mentioned the importance of skills and education, and also starting in a young age was the basis of the BizNet entrepreneurship training in Poland. They developed a digital business simulation tool for the purpose of running virtual company competitions. We have 3 more examples here, but many more on our website. So we mentioned the role of the third sector already, and this is demonstrated by the Exciso project. This was delivered, and this project is ongoing in Greece, in which an NGO created jobs for young adults with disabilities. Then the next example is the Covocat project, which set up 18 co-working spaces in rural areas in Spain, in Catalonia, and involved more than 130 professionals in the co-working network. You can see the picture. Different people with different professions can go and work together in these co-working spaces. And finally, Silta, Finland. The Silta project created a cooperative and managed entrepreneurship education. And from this initiative, several small businesses grew out of, and young people set up these small businesses. So I would like to invite you to visit our webpage and be inspired, because our collection of good practices of examples is already large and it's growing. So I mentioned that we would refer to some EU policy tools. You can see them all listed here, and there's more levels of detail, and we will give you the links as well, and we will discuss some of them during the work of this thematic group. Some are directly available for rural youth. Some of these require associated national policies, and some of these are available from the CAP strategic plans managed at member state level. And as we mentioned during our mini survey, relatively recent development is the talent booster mechanism, and some others have been around for some time and are based on earlier versions of like Erasmus Plus, for example. And Interreg is an ongoing thing. So at national, regional, and local level, there are potential opportunities offered that can be offered by national labor market policies against youth unemployment, for example, support to business startups, education and training initiatives, as well as work-based learning opportunities. Targeted services, for example, targeting young mothers to have them move back to the job market, targeting people moving to rural areas, helping them get integrated better, and other facilities, both physical, like broadband, and regulatory, like tax breaks, are also important. So to find out more about youth through an EU lens, the sources listed here provide in-depth and very interesting information. I would like to emphasize the Rural Observatory, for example. This offers information and analysis focusing on rural Europe, and you can also search for your own region, your own place, and look at how it looks like from the statistical point of view.